today, you will walk away with many new tools that you could incorporate into any kind of fat loss regimen that will greatly accelerate that process. We know that having body fat percentages that are too high is unhealthy for us, and most people struggle to lose fat. How many calories you ingest versus how many calories you burn is the fundamental and most important formula in this business of fat loss. There's simply no way around the fact that if you ingest far more calories than you burn, you're likely to gain weight. Remember, your nervous system, which includes your brain and your spinal cord and all the connections that they make with the organs of the body, governs everything. It's the on switch and the off switch for your immune system. The nervous system and the role of the brain and other neurons has been vastly overlooked in the discussion about losing fat. Neurons connect to your body fat and can change the probability that that body fat will be burned or not. So your nervous system is the master controller of this process, and it plays a strong role in the calories out, the calories burned component. Come to realize that these cells in our body, they are there as fuel for the furnace of our body, which is our metabolism. And there's a third player, and that's where it really gets interesting, that the nervous system, neurons, has the opportunity to turn up the intensity of that furnace. It has the opportunity to increase the amount of heat that we produce, and therefore the amount of energy that we burn. An incredible study that was done by my colleague, Aaliyah Crum at Stanford. So what they did was they took subjects who were hotel service people that would clean the hotels and come in and change the linens and so forth, divide them into two groups. One group, they were told, moving around and doing your duties for your job. The other group, however, was given a bunch of information about how movement and their daily routine was very good for cardiovascular health. It could be good for weight loss, etc. Then they tracked these subjects over a period of many weeks. The take-home message from this study was that simply being told that movement is good for you, can lead to weight loss, etc., led to significantly more body fat loss and all sorts of other positive effects on things like cardiovascular health, simply by the knowledge that movement and exercise can help various health markers. So this is remarkable, and it speaks to the power of the nervous system and the power of belief in governing aspects of our body and our physiology. So the first thing that has to happen for body fat to get burned up or used and reduced is that it has to get mobilized. You just have to move that fat out of the position that it's in. You have to get it out of the fat cells. Stored fat has two parts that are relevant here. It's got the fatty acid part, and that's the part that your body can use, and that's attached to something called glycerol, and they're linked by a backbone. So the first step is to get those fatty acids moving around in the bloodstream, to get them out of those fat cells. And then they can travel and be used for energy. The second part is oxidation. Those fatty acids, those are potential fuel. They're just potential fuel, but you haven't burned the fat yet. You've just moved it out of your fat cells. They're going to go into cells that can use them for energy. And once they are inside those cells, they're still not burned up. You need to oxidize them. You have to mobilize it, then you actually have to convert it into energy. If you just mobilize it and you don't convert it into energy, you don't oxidize it, it can be returned to body fat. So one of the most powerful ways to stimulate epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, from these neurons that connect to fat and to thereby stimulate more fat mobilization and oxidation is through movement. But I'm not talking about exercise. The type of movement that I'm referring to is extremely subtle, which is that shiver or shivering is a strong stimulus for the release of adrenaline, epinephrine, into fat and the increase in fat oxidation and mobilization. There was a group in England during the 1960s and 70s that discovered a pathway by which subtle forms of movement can greatly increase fat loss. This is the work of Rothwell and Stock. They were aware that some people overeat and yet don't put on weight. Other people overeat even just a little bit and they seem to accumulate extra adipose tissue. What they did was they examined people who overate and did not gain weight. And what they observed was that those people engaged in lots of subtle movement throughout the day. In other words, they were fidgeters. Fidgeters, people that bounce their knee, people that have a head bob while they're listening, people that nod a lot, people that stand up and sit down a lot throughout the day, and people that pace burn anywhere from 800 to 2,500 calories more than the control group in the experiments that they looked at. Rothwell and Stock and others that they worked with subsequently found that these little fidgety movements, the engagement of certain aspects of our musculature that are nothing like exercise, those subtle movements of our core musculature, not just the core, but all our limbs and our musculature, those low-level movements, they trigger epinephrine release from these neurons, and they stimulate the mobilization of fat. Different types of exercise engage the musculature of the body and the heart and the lungs in different ways, and can have vastly different effects on things like hormones and metabolism, depending on whether or not it's of high intensity, moderate intensity, or low intensity. If it's moderate intensity, so-called zone 2 cardio type exercise, at the 90-minute point, if you happen to have eaten before the exercise within 1 to 3 hours prior to the exercise, then you reduce the amount of fat that you will burn from 90 minutes onward. If you had fasted prior to the exercise, you hadn't eaten anything for 3 hours or more prior to the exercise, at the 90-minute point, 90 minutes of exercise, you will start to burn more fat than you would had you eaten. Now, there are also studies that point to the fact that you don't have to wait to 90 minutes in order to get this enhanced fat burning effect. So a set of lifting weights repeated, if that's done for anywhere from 20 minutes, so weight training or powerlifting or these kinds of things, or kettlebell swings, or up to 60 minutes, well, then the switchover point in which you can burn more fat if you go into that fasted comes earlier. So if you ate before the exercise, you'd have an increase in insulin. If you ate carbohydrates, you'd have a bigger increase in insulin. Fat and proteins indeed will have lower amounts of insulin, and fasting will give you the lowest amount of insulin. Well, then that switchover point is going to come earlier in the exercise. And if you think about it, if you were to do something high intensity for 20, 30, 40 minutes, so maybe lift weights and then get into zone 2 cardio, if you were fasted, the literature says that you're going to burn more body fat. You should pick exercise that you like, that you're going to do regularly, but it does seem that the high intensity exercise followed by moderate intensity exercise is going to be optimal for fat burning overall, because when you look at the percentage of body fat burned and you look at the overall increase in basal metabolic rate, moderate and high intensity training followed by low intensity training, or even just followed by going back into life, is going to be the best way to continue to burn body fat. This is mainly to try and shift people away from the kind of magic pill phenomenon, or the idea that there is a magic pill, because there really isn't, and frankly, there never will be. There are things that people can ingest that will allow them to oxidize more fat, and that occurs mainly by increasing the amount of epinephrine that is released from neurons that innervate fat tissue. It's well established that caffeine can enhance performance if you're caffeine adapted. If you are not used to drinking caffeine and you suddenly decide, I'm going to drink a big cup of coffee before training, you will vasoconstrict and you will limit performance. Now, caffeine for burning more fat, for oxidizing and mobilizing more fat, is an interesting one. It can be effective at dosages up to 400 milligrams. You have to be careful if you're caffeine sensitive. Some people have just the littlest bit of caffeine and their mind goes crazy and they're very uncomfortable. Caffeine can enhance the amount of fat that you burn in any duration of exercise, and it can shift the percentage of fat that you oxidize compared to glycogen. In terms of tools that are actionable and have reasonable safety margins, I've talked before about something called GLP-1. This is something that can be triggered by the ingestion of yerba mate, which is a tea. So if you want to burn more fat, drinking mate before exercise is good. Drinking it at rest when you're not exercising will also help shift your metabolism toward enhanced burning of fat by increasing fat oxidation. Some people who don't like mate might prefer something like guayusa. It's from Ecuador, and it's a sweeter tasting tea. It doesn't have any sweetener in it, but the leaf of the guayusa plant is sweeter than the mate plant. I sometimes will mix the two and then make the tea with that. L-carnitine, and acetyl L-carnitine in particular, facilitates fat oxidation. It helps convert fatty acids into ATP. And indeed, supplementing L-carnitine can increase fat loss. People ingest anywhere from 500 milligrams to 2 grams per day in divided doses, typically. It can slightly modify the pathway involving glucagon such that you get a considerable effect, not a huge effect, on fat oxidation, so it can improve fat oxidation rates. It doesn't really matter which diet you follow. You can still get a caloric deficit and you get weight loss. Adherence, however, is always an issue. If you can't stick with something, then it's not very worthwhile. What you eat and when you eat it set conditions in your body. And those conditions can be very good for you or very bad for you, depending on when you eat. First of all, when you eat, typically your blood glucose, your blood sugar, will go up. Also, insulin levels will go up. Insulin is a hormone that's involved in mobilizing glucose from the bloodstream. How much your glucose and insulin go up depends on what you eat and how much you eat. And grains and breads and pastas and so forth will raise your blood glucose more than fibrous carbohydrates like lettuce and broccoli and things of that sort. Protein has a somewhat moderate or modest impact on insulin and glucose, and fat has the lowest impact on raising your blood glucose and blood insulin. So what you eat will impact how steep a rise in blood glucose and insulin takes place. When we sleep, our body undergoes a number of different processes in the brain and body in order to recover the cells and tissues. You're already fasting when you're asleep, and how deep you are into that fast depends on how long it was since your last meal. So if you fast early in the day and you've been asleep for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, I would hope somewhere between 6 and 8 hours for most people is going to be beneficial. When you wake up, you don't want to eat for at least the first 60 minutes after waking. But were you to extend that fasting to say 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m., or even 12 noon or later, you are taking advantage of the deep fast that you were in during sleep and certainly toward the end of sleep. So one thing is certain, that you want your eating window to be tacked or attached to your sleep-based fasting in a way that makes it easier for you to get into the fasted state for a period of time. We now have several different rules that we can list out. First, at least no food for the first hour after waking up, at least 1 hour. 2, no food intake for 2 and ideally 3 hours prior to your bedtime. 3, if you want to select an 8-hour feeding window, then you should probably focus on a 6 or 7 hour feeding window because you're eating different things on different days, presumably. Some foods leave your gut more quickly. Some things spike your insulin and your glucose more than others. Sometimes you eat more fat, sometimes less fat. This allows you to fall well within the margins of the benefits of time-restricted feeding that have been demonstrated in humans, which generally involve an 8-hour window. The ketogenic diet has been shown in 22 studies to have a notable decrease on blood glucose, and that is not surprising. The essence of the ketogenic diet is that you're consuming very little or zero of the foods that promote big spikes in insulin and glucose. If you consume enough protein, some of that protein can be converted into glucose, of course, through gluconeogenesis. But the ketogenic diet has very strong support for its role in regulating blood sugar, which is glucose. I think if you watch for the feelings associated with eating and post-eating foods of different kinds and different amounts, and you watch for the feelings associated with being fasted for long periods of time or short periods of time, of having gotten sufficient sunlight, of having trained hard or not trained hard earlier that day, etc., you can do the most important thing, which is to start to learn to evaluate your own system, to run simple, safe experiments on your system in a way that allows you to really establish the ideal nutrition schedule.